Hi everyone, Jai Hind and welcome to the platform of StudyIQ IAS in English. My name is Bhanwar Singh NDA 115th course and qualified civil services in 2012, and I welcome you on the platform. Now on this session, in this video, we'll be talking about the UNSC or the United Nations Security Council. Now, when it comes to the multipolar world that we are seeing today, is it that it has lost its relevance? That is what we'll be inquiring into it. Now, when it comes to India, so India has, laid down a strong warning, and ultimately it has cautioned that the intergovernmental negotiations reform model that borders on the complete failure if it only expands the non-permanent members and the non-permanent seats in the United Nations Security Council. Now, there had been the rejection of half measures, and ultimately the draft reform text had been rejected by the India that bypassed the structural changes to the permanent core category. As well as when it comes to the current format, it says that this is ineffective because when it comes to the intergovernmental negotiations, they had been trapped in a circular procedural cycle, which had started from 2008, and we are talking about 2026. So this had been a gap of nearly about 20 years where there had been no written text-based negotiations which had been started for the reformation of the United Nations Security Council. And even over here, you can see that this is where we are pushing for the immediate correction of the democratic deficit that is there in the United Nations Security Council to truly reflect the 21st century geopolitical structure that we are talking about in this present situation or the global situation. Now, over here, when it comes to the United Nations Security Council, it was designed in 1945, or the UN was designed in 1945, basically reflecting the power configuration of the immediate aftermath of the World War II. And they were the P5 or the permanent 5 members that were they were granted the seat at the United Nations Security Council, which is the USA. We have UK, France, as well as Russia and China. They are the P5 or the permanent 5 members of the United Nations Security Council, which had been provided with a veto power as well. Now, there is the zero permanent representation for the entire continents that you will see in United Nations Security Council. Like, for example, Africa and even for the South America, which have they have the massive populations when it comes to the global scenario. There is also numerical incoherence where we have the membership that had scaled, and the initial membership was just 51 nations, but now we have the 193 nations which are the member, yet the permanent decision-making power or the core, it remains entirely frozen to the P5 members which are there. And there is also inability to resolve the contemporary crises that have severely eroded the Council's mandate as a custodian of the global peace for which it was mandated or for which it was instituted. Right now, when it comes to the major geopolitical coalition, you must remember that there is the G4 nation, which comprises of India along with Japan, Germany, and Brazil. They support each other's claim to the permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council and also pledging that there should be mutual reciprocity. At the same time, there is L69 and AU as well, that is African Union, where we have more than 40 of the developing nations which demand that there must be historic correction of the African and the Latin American underrepresentation in both the categories. And then we have the Coffee Club that is led by Italy, Pakistan, Mexico, and Egypt. Basically, they strongly oppose any new permanent seats that should be there in the United Nations Security Council, suggesting that there should be only expansion of the non-permanent seats which are there. Now, over here, it is very important that there had been systemic paralysis of the P5, where we can see that the intense confrontation between the West, that is led by US, then we have UK and France, and there is also the Russia and China axis. So over here, that has completely paralyzed the executive decision making of the council, because when it comes to the veto power, so if there is any issue, like for example, there was the Iran war, so ultimately that would have been vetoed, the proposal. It would have been vetoed either by Russia and China or either by US and UK, depending upon that what that proposal is all about. There is also the rise of minilateralism that you will see, where we have the various, architectures, the security architectures that are moving swiftly to alternative forums. Like, for example, we have the BRICS, we have the Quad, as well as the G20 forums which are there. Also, there is the veto shield that is there. The veto power is increasingly being utilized only as the defensive shield that you will see in the United Nations Security Council for the sovereign interest, rather than that they should have been used for the mechanism to prevent any kind of conflict that should have been there in the world. And there is also the Indo-Pacific shift, where you will see the global maritime and the economic growth or the qualities has shifted to the Indo-Pacific region, which remains severely, heavily underrepresented in the P5 category that is there, where we have just China that is represented. Now, over here, it is very important to know that when it comes to the power dynamics or the divergence, so the P5 wants the status quo. At the same time, the global south and the India's position is quite different. When it comes to the sovereign decision making, they want their own veto power or the veto-based oligarchic executive control. But when it comes to India's position, it demands for the sovereign equality and the representative floor in the United Nations Security Council. As well as there is geopolitical alignment and the containment of the rival. That is the major focus of the P5 nations. But the India wants and the global south wants to prevent the human security issues and even the supply chain shocks that we have seen recently in the West Asian crisis. And when it comes to the P5, so there is a Western financial leverage that dictates the security priorities. But at the same time, when it comes to the India and the global south, so developing nations provide the troops and ultimately they suffer the economic sanctions as well, which is a major difference between the India stance and the global south stance as compared to the P5 stance for the United Nations Security Council. Now, over here, you can see that there is a democratic deficit, where when it comes to the majority of the United Nations Security Council's peacekeeping operations, so they are mandated and the resolution, they are targeting the conflict zone that is there in Africa. Despite the massive concentration of the focus that is in Africa, you can see not a single African nation holds a permanent and the veto power or the veto wielding shield in the seat in the council. So over here, this signifies that there is a severe representation deficit when it comes to the global governance platform of the United Nations Security Council. Now, you can see that there were the reforms that were done in the United Nations Security Council. The United Nations Security Council came into existence by the San Francisco Charter, where there was establishment with the 5 permanent members, and initially there were just 6 non-permanent members that were there. Now, what has happened was that there is the first and the only reform that was done in 1965, where the non-permanent category was expanded to 10, but there was no change in the P5. In 2008, there was the IGN or Intergovernmental Negotiation which had been launched, and ultimately they are just failing. The negotiations are failing because they are turning into the endless cycles of the negotiations, and after 2026, you can see that there is the future that is obsolete for the United Nations Security Council because the threat is there of becoming it as an irrelevant talking shop that will be there. All right. Now, over here, it is very important that why reform had been blocked. Now, there is Article 108 that is there. Now, over here, modifying anything in the UN Charter, it requires that there must be, or the reform, or anything that you are modifying, the amendment, it must be passed by the General Assembly, by the 2/3 of the vote approval, and then it has to be ratified by all the 5 permanent members who hold the absolute veto power. At the same time, there is intergenerational regional deadlock as well, because when it comes to the regional rivalries, so they allow the status quo to survive in the United Nations Security Council. Like, for example, India's position is, it is opposed by Pakistan. In the same manner, the Italy counters Germany, and the Mexico is countering the Brazil's position when it comes to the United Nations Security Council. And there is also lack of text-based negotiation, where when it comes to the intergovernmental negotiations, so over here you can see that there is not a unified negotiating text which had ever been produced, and that have prevented any kind of formal progress for the reformation of the United Nations Security Council. So over here, what could be the way forward, and ultimately what could be the blueprint for India as well? So now there is very important that the group of 4 or G4, there must be reciprocity, where they should continue leveraging the partnership that is among each other, whether it is Germany, Brazil or Japan and India, so that the institutional and multi-regional pressure could be built up for the reformation of the United Nations Security Council. There must be also global south leadership, where we must capitalize on the India's stance of being the Vishwamitra or the friend of the world. And ultimately, we should be able to lead L69 and the African Union claims as well. Because as a global South leader, that is the position of India. We must be able to do that in the right manner. Also, there must be incremental veto deferral, where we must be willing to accept the new permanent seats without the immediate veto power as well. So that will be for a transitional period to break the deadlock that is right now for the reformation of the Security Council. And there must be comprehensive power hedging as well, where we must simultaneously strengthen the participation in the minilaterals, like for example, Quad and the BRICS, to make India's exclusion impossible if there is any change or the reform that is done in the United Nations Security Council. So that would be all. But at the same time, we must remember that when it comes to the United Nations, so it is the unreformed which risk becoming just an elegant talking shop, bypassed by the history and the contemporary realities as well. To remain relevant, it is the United Nations Security Council. It must transition from the post-World War II, the concert of the victors, to the 21st century concert of the representative democracies that it must represent. So that would be on this video, but at the same time, do not forget that we are offering you with the GS Foundation batches. If you are preparing for the civil services 2027, 28 or for 2029, you can enroll into this batch, and ultimately we have the resolution P2I batch, which had been modeled upon the structure of the SMART framework, where you get the structured classes, you get the mentorship, assessment, revision, and the test series as well. And for enrolling into this and for gaining the 50% off that we are offering you right now, which is only valid till the 18th of June, you can use the code BRS Live, and you will fetch the maximum discount on the platform of StudyIQ. So that would be all, but do not forget to like the session, share the session with your friends who are preparing for the civil services, and also subscribe to our channel so that you do not miss any of the updates. I will see you in the next video, but till then, take care and thank you. Bye-bye and Jai Hind.